Derek Williams never forgot where he came from. He grew up in a two-bedroom apartment on the rough side of Baltimore, sharing a room with his younger brother while their mother worked double shifts at the hospital just to keep the lights on. They didn't have much, but his mother always told him the same thing every night before bed. She'd say, "Baby, your circumstances don't define your destiny. You work hard, you stay honest, and one day you're gonna have everything you ever dreamed of." Derek held on to those words like they were gold. He started his first business at 16, cutting grass in the wealthy neighborhoods across town. He'd wake up at 5 in the morning, push his rusty lawnmower onto the city bus, and spend his summers making those rich folks' lawns look like something out of a magazine. Most of them never even looked him in the eye. They'd just leave the check under the doormat and go about their day. But Derek didn't let that bother him. He was learning. He was watching. He was taking notes on how the other half lived. By the time he graduated high school, he had saved up enough money to buy a used pickup truck. That truck became the foundation of everything. He started a small landscaping company, then expanded into property maintenance. By 25, he owned a construction firm. By 35, he had his hands in real estate development, commercial properties, and a logistics company that shipped goods across the entire East Coast. 20 years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice had turned that kid with the rusty lawnmower into a millionaire many times over. And now, at 47 years old, Derek was finally ready to give himself the reward he'd been putting off for decades. The Rolls-Royce Phantom sat in the dealership like a piece of art. It was midnight blue with a cream interior. And when Derek sat behind the wheel for the first time, he felt like he was floating on a cloud. The salesman kept asking if he was sure, kept suggesting maybe he'd like to look at something more practical. Derek just smiled, pulled out his checkbook, and wrote the full amount right there on the spot. $520,000. No financing. No payment plan. Just a man buying himself the dream he'd earned, but the car was only part of the dream. The bigger part was waiting for him 30 miles outside the city, in a gated community called Preston Heights. Preston Heights was the kind of neighborhood that showed up in luxury home magazines. Every house sat on at least an acre of land. The streets were lined with oak trees that had been there for 100 years. There was a private golf course, a clubhouse with a pool, and security guards at the gate who knew every resident by name. It was quiet, safe, and beautiful. It was everything Derek had pictured during those long nights in his childhood bedroom. Listening to sirens outside his window and dreaming of something better. The day he moved in was one of the happiest days of his life. He pulled through the gates in his Rolls-Royce, followed by the moving truck carrying everything he owned. His new house was a 6-bedroom colonial with white columns, a 3-car garage, and a backyard that stretched out toward a small pond. As he stepped out of his car and looked up at the front door, he felt tears forming in his eyes. He thought about his mother, who had passed away 5 years ago, and wished more than anything that she could see him now. "I made it, Mama," he whispered to himself. "I finally made it." He was so caught up in the moment that he almost didn't notice the woman standing on the porch next door. She was in her early 50s, with blonde hair that was clearly touched up at an expensive salon and a face that looked like it had never smiled a day in its life. She stood with her arms crossed, watching Derek with the kind of expression you'd give a stray dog that wandered into your yard. Derek raised his hand and waved. "Good morning. I'm your new neighbor. Just moved in today." The woman didn't wave back. She didn't say hello. She didn't even nod. She just stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment, then turned around and walked back into her house. The door closed behind her with a sharp click. Derek stood there for a second, a little confused. Maybe she was having a bad day? Maybe she was just shy. He decided not to think too much about it and got back to directing the movers. What Derek didn't know was that his new neighbor, Patricia Holloway, was already forming opinions about him. Very strong opinions. Patricia had lived in Preston Heights for 18 years. And for 11 of those years, she had served as the president of the Homeowners Association. She took that job more seriously than most people take their actual careers. She knew every rule in the community handbook by heart. She knew which houses had been repainted without approval, which families let their dogs bark too long, and which mailboxes were 3 inches too tall. Nothing happened in Preston Heights without Patricia knowing about it. And when she'd heard that someone new was moving into the Henderson place, she'd done her research. She knew what Derek Williams had paid for the house. She knew what kind of car he drove. She knew that he owned several businesses and had built his fortune from nothing, but none of that mattered to Patricia. What mattered to her was something much simpler and much uglier. In Patricia's mind, there was a certain type of person who belonged in Preston Heights. People with the right background, the right connections, the right look. And when she watched Derek step out of that Rolls-Royce, she'd already decided he wasn't the right type. She didn't say it out loud, of course. People like Patricia never did. But she thought it. And more importantly, she was going to act on it that evening. After the movers had gone and Derek was sitting in his empty living room eating pizza off a paper plate, he felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. The house was quiet. The neighborhood was quiet. Through the window, he could see fireflies blinking in his backyard, just like he'd always imagined. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his daughter, who was away at medical school. "Proud of you, Dad. You deserve this." Derek smiled and typed back a heart emoji. Then he leaned back against the wall, closed his eyes, and let himself enjoy the moment. He had no idea what was coming. 3 days later, Derek found an envelope tucked into his mailbox. It was from the Preston Heights Homeowners Association, and it was marked Urgent Violation Notice. He opened it, confused. He'd only been there 3 days. What could he possibly have violated? The letter accused him of improper trash receptacle placement. Apparently, his garbage cans were visible from the street, which was a violation of Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Community Guidelines. Derek walked to the end of his driveway and looked around. Every single house on the block had their trash cans in the exact same spot as his. Not one of them had a violation notice on their door. He crumpled the letter in his hand and took a deep breath. "It's fine," he told himself. "It's probably just a misunderstanding. I'll move the cans and everything will be okay." But deep down, something told him this was only the beginning. And across the way, watching from behind her curtain, Patricia Holloway smiled for the first time in weeks. She had plans for her new neighbor. Big plans. And Derek Williams had no idea just how far she was willing to go. Derek thought the trash can situation was a one-time thing. A small misunderstanding that would clear itself up once the HOA realized they'd made a mistake. So he moved his garbage cans to the side of his garage where nobody could possibly see them from the street. Problem solved, right? Wrong. 4 days later, another envelope showed up in his mailbox. This time, the violation was about his front door. According to the letter, the color he'd chosen was not on the approved palette for Preston Heights homes. The letter demanded that he repaint it within 14 days or face a fine of $200 per week until the issue was resolved. Derek stood at his front door and stared at it. The door was painted a deep burgundy color, the same color it had been when he bought the house. The previous owners had lived there for 12 years with that exact same door, and apparently nobody had ever said a word about it. But now, suddenly, it was a problem. Derek didn't argue. He didn't complain. He hired a painter and had the door changed to a neutral gray that was definitely on the approved list. He even sent a photo to the HOA office to confirm that the work had been completed. 1 week later, another letter arrived. This one accused him of parking a commercial vehicle in his driveway. The letter specifically mentioned his Rolls-Royce, claiming that its size and appearance suggested it was being used for business purposes, which violated community standards. Now, Derek was starting to get frustrated. A commercial vehicle? His personal car that he'd bought with his own money to drive himself around? He'd never used it for anything business-related in his life. It was his dream car, plain and simple. He wrote a detailed response to the HOA, including the vehicle registration proving it was registered as a personal vehicle, photos showing it was a standard Rolls-Royce Phantom with no commercial markings. and a copy of the purchase agreement from the dealership. He sent everything by certified mail so there would be a record. The HOA never responded to his letter. But they did stop sending violations about the car. Derek allowed himself to feel a small sense of victory. Maybe they finally understood that he wasn't someone who was going to just roll over. Maybe they'd leave him alone now. That hope lasted about 2 weeks. The next violation accused him of having grass that exceeded the maximum allowed height by half an inch. Half an inch. Derek couldn't believe what he was reading. Someone had actually come onto his property with a ruler and measured his grass. He knew exactly who that someone was. By now, Derek had started paying attention to Patricia Holloway. He noticed how she watched him from her window whenever he came home. He noticed how she walked past his house every morning, her eyes scanning his property like she was looking for something wrong. He noticed how she never acknowledged him, never returned his waves, never said a single word to him even though they'd been neighbors for over a month. He also started noticing something else. The other neighbors were friendly. A retired couple down the street, George and Helen, had stopped by with a welcome basket during his first week. A young family across the way always waved when they drove past. The guy who lived 2 houses down would chat with Derek about football whenever they both happened to be checking their mail at the same time. Everyone was nice except Patricia, and slowly, Derek started to understand what was really going on. One evening, he was taking a walk around the neighborhood when he ran into George and Helen sitting on their front porch. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" George called out. Derek smiled and walked over to say hello. They chatted for a few minutes about the weather and the upcoming community barbecue. Then Helen leaned in close, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "We've seen the letters," she said. "The violation notices. We know Patricia's been after you." Derek sighed. "So it's not just my imagination?" George shook his head. "She's been running this neighborhood like her personal kingdom for years. Most folks just stay out of her way because it's easier than fighting her. But what she's doing to you, it's not right. Has she done this to other people?" Derek asked. George and Helen exchanged a look. The kind of look that said they knew more than they wanted to say out loud. "There was a family a few years back," Helen finally said. "Nice people. They lasted about 8 months before they couldn't take it anymore and moved away. And there were others before them." Derek felt his stomach tighten. What did they all have in common? Helen didn't answer the question directly. She just patted Derek's hand and said, "You seem like a strong man. Don't let her run you out. This is your home. You have every right to be here." Derek thanked them and continued his walk, but his mind was racing. He'd worked too hard and come too far to be pushed out of his own home by someone like Patricia Holloway. He wasn't going anywhere. But Patricia wasn't done. Not even close. The violations kept coming. A complaint about his holiday lights being too bright. A complaint about a small American flag he'd hung by his front door. A complaint about noise from a family dinner where nobody had even raised their voice. Each complaint was more ridiculous than the last, but each one still required Derek to respond, to document, to prove he wasn't breaking any rules. It was exhausting. And Derek knew that was exactly the point. Patricia wanted to wear him down. She wanted to make his life so miserable that he'd eventually decide it wasn't worth the trouble and put his house up for sale. That's how she'd won before. And she was confident she'd win again. What Patricia didn't know was that Derek Williams had faced much harder things in his life than a bitter woman with too much time on her hands. He'd been doubted his whole life. He'd been underestimated, overlooked, and written off more times than he could count. And every single time, he'd proven everyone wrong. He wasn't about to stop now, but then something happened that changed everything. Something that took the situation from frustrating to dangerous. Patricia's son came home. His name was Brandon, and he was 20 years old. He'd been away at a private college out of state, a school his parents paid full tuition for even though his grades barely qualified him to get in. Brandon had grown up with everything handed to him. A nice house, nice cars, nice clothes, and a mother who told him every day that he was special, that he was better than everyone else, that he deserved the best simply because of who he was. Brandon had never worked a real job in his life. He'd never struggled for anything, and he'd spent his whole childhood absorbing his mother's views about the world, about who belonged in places like Preston Heights, and who didn't. When Brandon pulled into his parents' driveway for summer break, the first thing he saw was Derek's Rolls-Royce parked. Next door, something ugly flickered across his face. That night at dinner, Patricia filled her son in on everything that had been happening with the new neighbor. She complained about how Derek thought he could just move in and act like he owned the place. She complained about his fancy car and his fancy clothes and how he walked around like he was better than everyone. Brandon listened to every word, and with each sentence, the ugliness inside him grew a little darker. Someone needs to teach him a lesson, Brandon muttered. Patricia smiled and said nothing. She had no idea that her son's words weren't just empty talk. She had no idea that by feeding his hatred, she was setting something terrible in motion. And across the driveway, sitting peacefully in Derek's garage, the midnight blue Rolls-Royce gleamed under the dim light. It wouldn't gleam for much longer. For the next few weeks, Derek did his best to live his life normally. He went to work, came home, tended to his garden, and tried to ignore the constant feeling of being watched. The violation letters had slowed down a little, but they hadn't stopped completely. At this point, Derek had a whole folder full of them. He kept every single one organized by date, just in case he ever needed proof of what was happening, but something else had changed in the neighborhood. Something Derek could feel but couldn't quite put his finger on. It was the way Patricia's son looked at him. Brandon had been home for about 3 weeks now, and every time Derek saw him, the young man was staring. Not just glancing over casually like neighbors sometimes do. Actually staring with a hard expression on his face that made Derek uncomfortable. Derek tried to be friendly at first. One morning, he saw Brandon getting the mail and called out a simple hello. Brandon didn't respond. He just stared at Derek for a long moment, then turned and walked back inside without saying a word. After that, Derek stopped trying. He mentioned the situation to his daughter during one of their weekly phone calls. She was in her 3rd year of medical school now, working harder than ever, but she always made time to talk to her father. "Dad, this doesn't sound safe," she said, her voice full of concern. "Maybe you should talk to the police or something." "And tell them what?" Derek replied. "That my neighbor's kid looks at me funny? They'd laugh me out of the station. I don't like it. Something about this whole situation feels wrong." Derek sighed. "I know, sweetheart, but I can't let these people run me out of my own home. That's exactly what they want." His daughter was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Promise me you'll be careful, and maybe think about getting some security cameras or something." That was actually good advice. The next day, Derek called a security company and had a full system installed. Cameras on every corner of the house, motion sensors in the yard, and a video doorbell that recorded everyone who came to his front door. The footage was stored in the cloud, which meant even if something happened to the equipment, the recordings would be safe. It was an expensive system, but Derek believed in protecting what was his. He'd worked too hard to take any chances. The security company finished the installation on a Thursday. Derek tested everything that night and went to bed feeling a little more secure than he had in weeks. He had no idea how important those cameras were about to become. It was a Saturday night. A little over a week later, Derek had spent the day doing yard work and cleaning out his garage. He was tired in a good way, the kind of tired that comes from honest physical labor. He made himself a simple dinner, watched some television, and went to bed around 11 o'clock. The house was quiet. The neighborhood was quiet. The only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the occasional cricket chirping outside his window. Derek fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. At 2:34 in the morning, his phone started buzzing. Derek woke up confused, not sure what was happening at first. Then he saw the notification on his screen. It was from his security system. Motion detected in the driveway. He sat up in bed and opened the app, his heart starting to beat a little faster. The screen loaded, and Derek found himself looking at a live feed from his driveway camera. There was someone out there, a figure dressed in dark clothes with a hood pulled up over their head. The person was crouched down next to Derek's Rolls-Royce, doing something near the front tire that Derek couldn't quite make out. Then Derek saw it. A red container in the person's hand. The kind of container people used to carry. Gasoline. Derek's blood ran cold. He watched in horror as the figure stood up and started pouring liquid all over the hood of his car. The person moved quickly, splashing the gasoline across the roof, the doors, the windows. Then they pulled something from their pocket, a lighter. Derek was already running down the stairs, his phone still in his hand. He was dialing 911 as he ran, shouting his address to the operator before he even reached the front door. But he was too late. By the time Derek threw open his front door, flames were shooting up from his car. The fire spread so fast it was almost unbelievable. Within seconds, the entire vehicle was engulfed. The heat so intense that Derek had to stumble backward to avoid being burned. He saw the figure running away down the street. Disappearing into the darkness between two houses, Derek stood in his driveway, watching his dream car burn, and felt something break inside him. Not his spirit. That was still intact. But something else. Some last hope he'd been holding on to, that maybe this was all just a misunderstanding. That maybe people weren't really as cruel as they seemed. That hope was gone now. Burning up along with his Rolls-Royce, the fire department arrived within 8 minutes, but there was nothing they could do. The car was completely destroyed. All that was left was a twisted, blackened frame sitting in a pool of melted rubber and broken glass. Police officers showed up right behind the fire trucks. They asked Derek if he had any idea who might have done this. Derek told them about Patricia, about the months of harassment, about the son who stared at him with hatred in his eyes. Then Derek remembered something. "I have cameras," he said. "I have the whole thing on video." The lead detective's eyebrows went up. "You recorded the incident?" "Everything. Every angle. It's all saved to the cloud." They went inside and Derek pulled up the footage on his laptop. The detective leaned in close, watching the hooded figure approach the car, pour the gasoline, and light the fire. "Can you zoom in on the face?" The detective asked. Derek rewound the footage to a moment when the figure had looked up briefly. He zoomed in as much as the video quality would allow. The hood had slipped back just a little. Just enough to show the face underneath. It was Brandon Holloway. The detective recognized him immediately. Brandon had gotten into some minor trouble before. Stupid college kid stuff that his mother had always managed to sweep under the rug. But this was different. This was arson. This was a felony. "We'll pick him up first thing in the morning," the detective said. Derek nodded slowly, still staring at the face on his screen. He didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel vindicated. He just felt tired. So incredibly tired. The sun came up a few hours later, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Derek was sitting on his front porch with a cup of coffee, looking at the burned remains of his car. When he saw the police cruisers pull up in front of the Holloway house, he watched as the officers walked up to the door. He watched as Patricia answered. Confusion on her face at first, then shock. Then something that looked almost like fear. He watched as they brought Brandon out in handcuffs, his head hanging low, not looking so tough anymore, and he watched as Patricia started screaming at the officers, demanding to know what was happening, insisting that there must be some kind of mistake, but there was no mistake. The video was clear. The evidence was undeniable. Derek took a sip of his coffee and said nothing. The real fight was just beginning. The news spread through Preston Heights like wildfire. By noon on the day of Brandon's arrest, everyone in the neighborhood knew what had happened. People who had never spoken to Derek before were suddenly showing up at his door with casseroles and apologies. They told him how sorry they were, how shocked they were, how they never imagined something like this could happen in their quiet little community. Derek thanked them all politely. But inside he felt a strange mix of emotions. Where were all these people when Patricia was sending him violation letter after violation letter? Where were they when her son was staring him down like he wanted to hurt him? They'd all seen what was happening. They'd all known something was wrong. But nobody had said anything until it was too late. Still, Derek wasn't the type to hold grudges. He accepted their kindness and tried to focus on what came next. And what came next was bigger than anyone expected. Within 48 hours of the arrest, a petition started circulating through the neighborhood. Someone had finally had enough courage to do what should have been done years ago. The petition called for Patricia Holloway to be removed as president of the Homeowners Association. Effective immediately, the signatures came flooding in. People who had been afraid to speak up for years were suddenly finding their voices. One by one, they added their names to the list. And with each signature came a story. There was the Rodriguez family, who had moved out 3 years ago after Patricia filed 17 complaints against them in a single month. There was the Chun family, who had been denied permission to build a fence that white families in the neighborhood had built without any problems. There was a single mother named Denise who had been fined repeatedly for letting her children play in the front yard, something that every other family did without consequence. The pattern was undeniable. Patricia hadn't just been enforcing the rules. She'd been using her position to push out anyone who didn't fit her narrow idea of who belonged in Preston Heights. The stories made their way to the local news. A reporter from the city's biggest television station showed up at the neighborhood gates, asking questions and filming footage of the burned car still sitting in Derek's driveway. The story ran on the evening news that night, and by the next morning, it had been picked up by national outlets. Suddenly, everyone was talking about Preston Heights. Everyone was talking about Patricia Holloway. And everyone was talking about Derek Williams, the self-made millionaire whose Rolls-Royce had been set on fire by his neighbor's son. Patricia tried to get ahead of the story. She released a statement through her lawyer saying that she was shocked by her son's actions and that she had no involvement in what happened. She called it a tragedy and asked for privacy during this difficult time. Nobody believed her. The HOA board held an emergency meeting 3 days after the arrest. Patricia showed up with her head held high, still acting like she was in charge. But the moment she walked into the community center, she could feel the shift in the room. People who had smiled at her for years were now avoiding eye contact. People who had followed her every order were now whispering behind her back. The vote was unanimous. Patricia Holloway was removed as HOA president effective immediately. She was also banned from attending any future board meetings or community events. Patricia stood up, her face red with anger and humiliation. She looked around the room at all the people who had once feared her. All the people who had let her do whatever she wanted for more than a decade. "You're all going to regret this," she said, her voice shaking. Then she walked out, slamming the door behind her, but losing her HOA position was just the beginning of Patricia's problems. Derek had hired a lawyer. A very good lawyer. One of the best civil rights attorneys in the state. A woman named Valerie Chun who had won dozens of cases involving discrimination and harassment. Valerie took one look at Derek's folder full of violation letters, listened to the stories from other families who had been pushed out of the neighborhood, and knew exactly what they were dealing with. "This isn't just about a burned car," Valerie told Derek during their first meeting. "This is about a pattern of behavior. Years of targeted harassment, and I think we can prove that Patricia created an environment that led directly to what her son did." Derek nodded slowly. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we sue. Not just Brandon for the arson, but Patricia too." "For everything she's done?" The lawsuit was filed 2 weeks later. It named both Brandon and Patricia Holloway as defendants. It outlined the months of harassment Derek had faced, the pattern of discrimination against minority families in Preston Heights, and the argument that Patricia's behavior had encouraged and enabled her son's actions. The amount Derek was seeking made headlines across the country. $7 million. When reporters asked why such a large amount, Valerie explained it simply. $500,000 for the vehicle, $1 million for emotional distress and the hostile environment my client was forced to endure, and $5.5 million in punitive damages. Because people like Patricia Holloway need to understand that this kind of behavior has consequences. The story exploded. It was on every news channel, every website, every social media platform. People were sharing Derek's story from coast to coast, and the response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from strangers who had faced similar situations in their own neighborhoods. Civil rights organizations offered their support. Even a few celebrities posted about the case, calling for justice, but not everyone was supportive. Some people accused Derek of being greedy, of trying to cash in on a bad situation. Some people defended Patricia, saying she was just trying to maintain standards in her community. The comment sections of news articles became battlegrounds between people who saw Derek as a hero and people who saw him as a troublemaker. Derek tried not to read the comments. His daughter had warned him that it would only make him angry, and she was right. Instead, he focused on the case and on rebuilding his life. The criminal case against Brandon was moving forward too. Prosecutors had charged him with first-degree arson, which carried a sentence of up to 15 years in prison. But that wasn't all. After investigators went through Brandon's phone, they found messages that revealed the true motivation behind the attack. Ugly messages filled with hatred and slurs, messages that made it clear Brandon hadn't just burned a car. He'd burned it because of who owned it. The prosecution added a hate crime enhancement to the charges. If convicted, Brandon was looking at even more time behind bars. Patricia hired the most expensive defense attorneys she could find. She sold one of her rental properties to pay for their fees. She gave interviews to friendly media outlets, trying to paint herself as a victim of a witch hunt. She insisted that her son was a good boy who had made a mistake, that the hate crime charges were overblown, that Derek was blowing everything out of proportion. But the evidence was overwhelming. The video. The messages. The years of documented harassment. Everything pointed to one undeniable truth. Patricia Holloway had spent years creating a monster. And now that monster had destroyed not just Derek's car, but her entire family's future. As the court date approached, Derek felt a sense of calm he hadn't expected. He wasn't doing this for revenge. He wasn't doing it for money. He was doing it because some things are worth fighting for. Because if he didn't stand up, Patricia would just find another target, another family to torment, another person to push out of their home. Someone had to say enough. And Derek Williams was ready to be that someone. The criminal trial came first. Derek sat in the courtroom every single day, dressed in a simple suit, his face calm and composed. He watched as the prosecutors laid out their case piece by piece. The security footage was played for the jury. The hateful messages from Brandon's phone were read out loud. Witnesses testified about the pattern of harassment that had led up to that terrible night. Brandon's defense attorneys tried everything they could. They argued that their client was young and stupid, that he'd made a terrible mistake but didn't deserve to have his life ruined. They brought in character witnesses who talked about what a nice boy Brandon had been growing up. They even tried to suggest that the messages on his phone were just jokes, that Brandon didn't really mean any of it. The jury didn't buy it. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, they came back with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. First-degree arson, hate crime enhancement, destruction of property. Brandon's mother let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a sob. Brandon himself just sat there, staring straight ahead, like he still couldn't believe this was really happening to him, that the sentencing came 3 weeks later. The judge was a stern woman in her 60s who had seen a lot of cases in her career. She looked at Brandon for a long moment before she spoke. Mr. Holloway, you had every advantage in life. A comfortable home, loving parents, a good education, and yet you chose to commit an act of hatred and destruction against a man who had done nothing to you except exist in a space you felt he didn't belong. She paused, letting her words sink in. Actions have consequences. And today, you're going to learn that lesson. Brandon was sentenced to 5 years in state prison, followed by 10 years of probation. He would be required to complete extensive counseling and community service. He would be a convicted felon for the rest of his life, which meant he would never be able to vote, own a firearm, or pass a basic background check for most jobs. As the bailiffs led Brandon away in handcuffs, he finally looked over at Derek. For a moment their eyes met. Derek expected to see anger or hatred in the young man's face, but instead he just saw fear. The fear of someone who had finally realized that his actions had consequences and that his mother couldn't protect him anymore. Derek felt no joy watching Brandon get taken away. He didn't feel satisfaction or triumph. He just felt tired, and maybe a little sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that hatred had cost everyone so much, but the criminal case was only half the battle. The civil lawsuit went to mediation 6 months after Brandon's sentencing. Patricia's attorneys had been pushing for a settlement for months. They knew that if the case went to trial, it would be a disaster for their client. The evidence was too strong. The public opinion was too negative. A jury would almost certainly award Derek everything he was asking for. Maybe even more. Derek's attorney, Valerie, advised him to consider settling. Going to trial would mean more stress, more media attention, more months of his life consumed by this situation. A settlement would give him closure and let him move on. Derek thought about it for a long time. Part of him wanted to go to trial, wanted to make Patricia sit in that courtroom and face everything she had done. But another part of him just wanted it to be over. He'd already proven his point. The whole world knew what Patricia Holloway was really like. Did he really need to drag this out any longer? In the end, he decided to settle. The final number was $7.2 million. Even more than he had originally asked for. Patricia's attorneys had been so desperate to avoid a trial that they'd agreed to almost everything Derek's team demanded. Patricia had to sell her house to pay her share of the settlement. The home she had guarded so carefully, the neighborhood she had controlled for so many years, was no longer hers. Derek heard she moved to a small condo on the other side of the city, far away from Preston Heights and all the people who now knew exactly who she was. Derek never saw her again. The money was more than Derek had ever expected to receive, but it didn't change who he was. He'd been rich before this happened, and he was still the same person now. The money wasn't going to make him happy. It wasn't going to erase the pain of what he'd been through, but it could do some good. Derek used a portion of the settlement to establish a scholarship fund. He named it after his mother, the woman who had worked double shifts her whole life just to give her sons a chance. The scholarship would help first-generation college students from underserved communities, kids just like Derek had been, kids with big dreams and nobody to help them achieve them. The first scholarships were awarded the following fall. Derek attended the ceremony and shook hands with each recipient. Looking at their hopeful faces, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Real, genuine pride. Not in himself, but in what the future might hold for these young people. He also bought another Rolls-Royce. This one was even more beautiful than the first. A deep emerald green with a black interior, custom made to his exact specifications. When it arrived at his house, Derek stood in his driveway and looked at it for a long time. It wasn't about the car, not really. It was about what the car represented. It was about refusing to let hatred win. It was about standing tall even when people tried to tear you down. He parked it right in his driveway, exactly where the old one used to be. Life in Preston Heights slowly returned to normal, but it was a different kind of normal. The new HOA board implemented anti-discrimination policies and created a review process for complaints to make sure no one could weaponize the rules ever again. Neighbors who had been afraid to connect started having block parties and cookouts. Families of all backgrounds began moving in, and this time they were welcomed with open arms. Derek thought about leaving many times. He had the money to live anywhere in the world. He could buy a mansion on the beach or a penthouse in the city. He could start over somewhere nobody knew his name or his story, but every time he considered it, he came back to the same conclusion. This was his home. He had earned it, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. One warm evening in late summer, almost 2 years after the fire, Derek hosted a neighborhood barbecue. Over 50 people showed up. Families with kids running around the backyard. Elderly couples sitting in lawn chairs sharing stories. Young professionals meeting their neighbors for the first time. George and Helen were there, of course. They'd become close friends with Derek over the past 2 years. Helen brought her famous potato salad, and George spent the whole evening telling anyone Who would listen about his glory days as a high school football coach? As the sun started to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Derek's daughter arrived. She'd finished medical school and was now doing her residency at a hospital just 30 minutes away. She ran up to her father and hugged him tight. "I'm so proud of you, Dad," she whispered in his ear. Derek held his daughter close and looked out at his backyard full of people laughing and talking and enjoying each other's company. He thought about his mother, about everything she had sacrificed, about the words she used to say to him every night before bed. "Your circumstances don't define your destiny." She'd been right. She'd always been right. Derek raised his glass toward the setting sun and smiled. He'd faced hatred, and he'd answered it with dignity. He'd faced injustice, and he'd answered it with perseverance. He'd faced people who wanted to destroy everything he'd built, and he'd answered them by building something even better. Some dreams, he realized, aren't just worth having, they're worth fighting for, and Derek Williams had proven that beyond any doubt.